This is the entire Second World War. As the Soviet Union lived and fought it. August 23rd, 1939. Moscow, past midnight. In a room thick with cigar smoke, two men shake hands over a map of Eastern Europe. One represents Adolf Hitler, the other, Joseph Stalin. Within hours, they will carve Poland in half. The world will call it a non-aggression pact. History will remember it as a bargain with the devil, one that both sides knew would break. But here is what the newsreels did not show. Stalin believed he had bought time. Hitler believed he had secured his eastern flank. Both were calculating. Both were wrong about how quickly the calculation would unravel. 22 months later, the largest invasion in human history will shatter the Soviet Union's western border. 4 years after that, Soviet soldiers will raise a red flag over the Reichstag in Berlin. Between those two moments lies a war that will consume 27 million Soviet lives, transform a backward agricultural state into an industrial superpower, and redraw the map of Europe for half a century. Not from Washington or London, but from Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad. Not as a distant struggle won by industrial might and moral clarity, but is an existential fight for survival that began with catastrophic defeats, turned on brutal adaptation, and ended with vengeful triumph. The Western narrative speaks of D-Day and island-hopping campaigns. The Soviet story is different. It is a story of cities besieged until people ate wallpaper paste, of factories dismantled and shipped east on flatbed trains while German tanks approached, of penal battalions sent to clear minefields with their bodies, of a regime that survived by matching Nazi brutality with its own brand of ruthlessness. The comfortable assumption that the Second World War was primarily won by American production and British resolve evaporates when the numbers arrive. 80% of German military casualties occurred on the Eastern Front. The Battle of Kursk involved more tanks than all Western Front battles combined. By the time Allied forces landed in Normandy, Soviet armies had already driven German forces back across half of Eastern Europe. This was not a war the Soviet Union chose. It was a war Stalin's paranoia and opportunism made inevitable. The question facing Soviet planners in 1939 was not whether conflict with Germany would come, but whether the Red Army could survive long enough to make the immense Soviet geography and population count. The answer nearly came too late. The storm gathered in the West first, Germany rearmed, Europe fractured. Stalin watched, calculated, and made a wager that would nearly destroy the state he ruled. The comfortable fiction held by many in the Kremlin in 1939 was that capitalist powers would exhaust each other in another protracted war while the Soviet Union industrialized behind secure borders. Stalin had purged the military leadership. Thousands of experienced officers shot or imprisoned on fabricated charges of treason. The Red Army was vast but poorly led, equipped with outdated doctrine, and suspicious of its own commanders. Any delay before confronting Germany seemed prudent. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact delivered that delay and more. Secret protocols attached to the Public Non-Aggression Treaty divided Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. The Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, fell to the Soviet side of the line. Eastern Poland became Soviet territory. Finland was marked for absorption. On paper, Stalin had secured buffer zones. In practice, he had shown Hitler that Soviet foreign policy operated without ideological constraint. Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939. Britain and France declared war 2 days later. On September 17th, Soviet forces crossed into eastern Poland, crushing scattered resistance from an already defeated Polish military. The official explanation was protection of Ukrainian and Belarusian populations. The operational reality was territorial expansion coordinated with Nazi Germany. Polish officers were taken prisoner. Roughly 22,000 of them would be executed in forests near Katyn and other locations the following spring, a fact the Soviet government would deny for 50 years. The Baltic states were absorbed through manufactured political crises in the summer of 1940. Elections were held under Soviet occupation. New governments requested annexation. The process was swift, coercive, and internationally condemned. Deportations followed. Political leaders, intellectuals, military officers, anyone who might resist integration into the Soviet system. Trains carried them east to labor camps in Siberia and Kazakhstan. Finland resisted. In November 1939, Soviet forces invaded, expecting quick capitulation. The Winter War exposed catastrophic weaknesses in the Red Army. Finnish troops, outnumbered and outgunned, used terrain and mobility to inflict humiliating losses. Soviet casualties mounted. International opinion turned sharply against Moscow. The League of Nations expelled the Soviet Union. After 3 months of grinding combat, Finland ceded territory but retained independence. The cost in Soviet prestige was severe. The cost in lessons learned was insufficient. Stalin observed these operations and concluded that the Red Army needed reform, better equipment, and above all, more time. German successes in Western Europe, Denmark, Norway, the Netherlands, Belgium, France, all fell in 1940 with shocking speed. Britain stood alone. The Luftwaffe bombed London. German forces did not cross the Channel, but the European balance of power had shifted decisively. Stalin sent raw materials to Germany: grain, oil, strategic metals. Trade agreements were honored meticulously. The calculus was transparent. Keep Germany supplied, keep Germany looking west, buy time to rebuild the officer corps and modernize equipment. Intelligence reports reached Moscow throughout 1940 and early 1941, warning of German troop concentrations near the Soviet border. Warnings came from multiple sources: Soviet spies in Germany, British intelligence, even operatives in Japan. Stalin dismissed them. He believed Hitler would not risk a two-front war while Britain remained undefeated. He believed German generals would not attempt what Napoleon had failed to achieve. He believed he had read the strategic situation correctly. He was wrong. Out of sight, German planners finalized Operation Barbarossa. The largest invasion in history would strike simultaneously across a 1,000-mile front. 3 million German soldiers, supported by Finnish and Romanian forces, prepared to destroy the Soviet Union in a single summer campaign. Hitler expected Soviet resistance to collapse within weeks. His generals expected Moscow to fall before winter. The timetable allowed no room for error. Soviet intelligence detected the buildup but could not convince the leadership that war was imminent. In the final weeks before the invasion, Soviet forces were ordered not to respond to provocations, not to give Germany any pretext for conflict. On June 21, 1941, a German sergeant deserted and crossed into Soviet lines. He reported that the attack would begin at dawn. Soviet commanders forwarded the information to Moscow. Stalin refused to believe it. Orders went out to frontier units: do not respond to provocations. The next morning, the border exploded. June 22, 1941. At 3:15 a.m., German artillery opened fire along the entire western frontier of the Soviet Union. Luftwaffe bombers struck Soviet airfields, destroying hundreds of aircraft on the ground before pilots could reach their planes. Within hours, entire air regiments ceased to exist. Panzer divisions punched through frontier defenses, bypassing strong points, racing toward objectives deep in Soviet territory. By noon, forward Soviet command posts lost contact with higher headquarters. Communications collapsed, entire armies disintegrated into fragments. The speed was unlike anything Soviet commanders had prepared for. German mechanized columns advanced 30, 40, sometimes 50 miles in a single day. Soviet forces attempted to counterattack with outdated tactics. Massed infantry assaults supported by tanks that broke down or ran out of fuel. German air superiority turned roads into killing zones. Retreating Soviet units found bridges destroyed, supply depots overrun, escape routes cut. Within a week, German forces had encircled hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops near Minsk. The pocket was methodically crushed. Stalin remained silent for 11 days. The initial invasion caught him in a state of paralysis. His certainty shattered, his calculations revealed as catastrophically flawed. When he finally addressed the Soviet people on July 3rd, his message combined appeals to Russian patriotism with frank acknowledgement of the crisis. The war was not called a defense of socialism. It was called the Great Patriotic War, invoking the struggle against Napoleon in 1812. The message was clear. Survival, not ideology, was at stake. The Red Army fell back in chaos. Smolensk fell. Kiev was encircled. Over 500,000 Soviet soldiers were captured in the Kiev pocket alone, the largest encirclement in military history. German planners studied maps and adjusted timetables. Army Group Center aimed for Moscow. Army Group North drove toward Leningrad. Army Group South pushed into Ukraine. The Wehrmacht operated on the assumption that Soviet resistance would collapse before winter. Captured equipment was inferior. Captured soldiers often poorly trained. The invasion seemed to confirm every assumption about Soviet weakness, but something unexpected was happening in the spaces between German advances. Factories in threatened cities received orders to dismantle and evacuate. Entire industrial plants, machine tools, equipment, trained workers were loaded onto trains and shipped east. Over 1,500 factories were relocated to the Urals, Siberia, and Central Asia in the second half of 1941. Production stopped, moved, and resumed hundreds of miles from the front. The Soviet system, chaotic and brutal in peacetime, demonstrated a capacity for ruthless prioritization under existential threat. Scorched earth policies were implemented. Retreating Soviet forces destroyed infrastructure, burned crops, evacuated livestock. Anything useful to the Germans was to be denied. Partisan units were organized behind German lines, irregular forces tasked with sabotage, intelligence gathering, and making occupied territory ungovernable. The initial partisan efforts were poorly coordinated and suffered heavy casualties, but they established networks that would grow more effective as the war progressed. By September, German forces had advanced deep into Soviet territory. Leningrad was surrounded. Moscow lay within striking distance. The Red Army had suffered devastating losses. Millions of soldiers killed, captured, or missing. Equipment losses were staggering. Entire military districts had ceased to function. Western observers expected Soviet collapse within weeks. And yet the front did not break completely. Leningrad had been Russia's window to Europe since Peter the Great built it on marshland at the edge of the Baltic. By 1941, it was the Soviet Union's second city, industrial center, cultural capital, home to 3 million people. German forces reached the outskirts in September 1941. Hitler's orders were explicit. The city was to be encircled, starved, and erased from existence. No surrender would be accepted. The population was to be annihilated through hunger and bombardment. The siege began on September 8, 1941. German forces cut the last land routes into the city. Finnish forces pressed from the north, stopping at the pre-1939 border but completing the encirclement. Leningrad was trapped. The only supply route was across Lake Ladoga. Open water until winter, then treacherous ice, always under German artillery fire. The city began to starve. Rations were cut, then cut again. By November, the official daily bread ration for civilians was 125 grams, roughly 2 slices. There was little else. Fuel ran out. Temperatures dropped to minus 30 degrees Celsius. People burned furniture, then books, then anything combustible. Water pipes froze. electricity failed. The city descended into a frozen hell where survival meant scavenging, bartering, and enduring conditions designed to kill. Deaths mounted. Thousands died daily in December 1941. Bodies lay in the streets, too many to bury, the ground too frozen to dig. Sledges piled with corpses became common sights. Families kept dead relatives in unheated rooms to continue drawing their rations. The siege became a test of how long human beings could function in conditions meant to extinguish them. The road of life opened across the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga in November. Trucks carried supplies inward, evacuated the desperate outward. The ice was unstable. Vehicles broke through. German artillery targeted the route. Drivers made the crossing in darkness, navigating by markers, racing against time and temperature. The tonnage delivered was never sufficient, but it kept the city breathing. Leningrad's factories continued producing. Workers operated lathes in unheated buildings, frostbite rotting their fingers, subsisting on starvation rations. Artillery shells and tank components were manufactured within earshot of German guns. The industrial output was modest compared to peacetime, but it represented defiance against the siege's purpose. The city was supposed to die. It refused. By the spring of 1942, the death rate began to decline. Not because conditions improved, but because the weakest had already died. Survivors adapted to existence measured in calories and daylight. The siege continued through 1942, through 1943. Soviet forces attempted to break the encirclement multiple times. Offensives were launched, ground was gained and lost. Casualties accumulated. A narrow land corridor was opened in January 1943, allowing rail supplies to reach the city, but German artillery still covered the route. The full siege was not lifted until January 1944. The final count is disputed, but roughly 1 million Leningrad residents died during the siege. Most starved. Others succumbed to disease, cold, or bombardment. The siege lasted 872 days, the longest and deadliest siege of a city in modern history. German forces never entered Leningrad. The city held. While Leningrad endured, the front across the rest of the Soviet Union stabilized and shifted. The question was no longer whether the Soviet Union would survive the summer of 1941. It was whether it could survive the winter. And what would happen when Germany tried again in 1942? German forces reached the outskirts of Moscow in November 1941. Reconnaissance units observed the Kremlin through binoculars. The Soviet government evacuated to Kuibyshev, hundreds of miles east. Stalin remained in Moscow, a calculated decision to prevent panic. The capital's fall seemed inevitable. The Red Army counterattacked on December 5, 1941. Fresh divisions from Siberia and the Far East, troops trained for winter combat, equipped with white camouflage, supported by T-34 tanks, struck German positions weakened by cold and overextension. German soldiers were freezing in summer uniforms. Equipment failed in sub-zero temperatures. Supply lines stretched across hundreds of miles of hostile territory. The Wehrmacht had planned for a quick victory. It had not planned for winter. Soviet forces pushed German armies back from Moscow, reclaiming territory, inflicting Germany's first major defeat of the war. The victory was significant, but limited. German forces retreated to defensive positions and held. The front stabilized west of Moscow. The Red Army attempted to exploit the success with offensives across the entire front in early 1942. Most failed. Soviet forces lacked the coordination, logistics, and tactical sophistication to turn local victories into strategic collapse. German defensive doctrine absorbed the attacks, but the psychological impact was profound. The Wehrmacht was not invincible. Soviet soldiers had stopped the German advance, counterattacked successfully, and proven that winter was a weapon. Propaganda emphasized the victory. The defense of Moscow became a symbol of resistance, evidence that the catastrophe of 1941 could be reversed. Stalin drew the wrong lessons. he believed aggressive offensives could drive German forces from Soviet territory in 1942. Soviet commanders planned ambitious operations aimed at liberating Ukraine and pushing toward the Dnieper River. The offensives launched in the spring of 1942 were poorly coordinated disasters. German forces counterattacked, encircled Soviet units, and inflicted staggering casualties. The Second Battle of Kharkov in May 1942 ended with 250,000 Soviet troops captured or killed. The Red Army was learning through failure, and failure in 1942 still meant crippling losses. German strategy shifted for the 1942 campaign. Hitler directed forces toward the south, the oil fields of the Caucasus, the industrial centers of southern Russia. Army Group South advanced rapidly in the summer. Soviet forces retreated, attempting to avoid encirclement. The front moved east again, but this time Soviet forces traded space for time more deliberately. The chaotic collapse of 1941 was not repeated, but the Wehrmacht still advanced hundreds of miles. One city became the focal point: Stalingrad. Stalingrad stretched along the western bank of the Volga River, an industrial city, a transportation hub, a place whose symbolic value far exceeded its strategic importance. It bore Stalin's name. Its fall would be a propaganda catastrophe. Its defense would be total. German forces reached the outskirts in August 1942. The plan was swift capture, followed by a drive south toward the Caucasus oil fields. Stalingrad had other intentions. Soviet defenders dug into rubble, fought from basements and sewers, contested every building. The Luftwaffe bombed Stalingrad into ruins. The ruins became defensive positions. German infantry advanced block by block, floor by floor, sometimes room by room. A Soviet soldier's life expectancy in Stalingrad was measured in hours, not days. The 62nd Army, commanded by General Vasily Shvykov, held a narrow strip along the Volga. Supply and reinforcement came across the river at night, boats dodging artillery fire, delivering ammunition, and troops evacuating wounded. The reinforcements were often workers' militias and penal troops, poorly trained men thrown into combat with minimal preparation. The doctrine was simple: hold the city regardless of cost. Retreating across the Volga was forbidden. Units that broke were shot by barrier troops. Survival meant advancing or dying in place. The fighting in Stalingrad descended into a level of brutality that defied strategic logic. German and Soviet soldiers fought for individual buildings, sometimes occupying different floors of the same structure. Snipers stalked ruins. Combat was intimate. Grenades, bayonets, entrenching tools used as weapons. The grain elevator, the railway station, the Barricadi factory, Mamayev Kurgan, each became a killing ground contested for weeks. The Wehrmacht poured reinforcements into the city. The Red Army matched them. Both sides fed the meat grinder. By November, German forces controlled most of Stalingrad. The Soviet foothold on the western bank was reduced to a few pockets. The 62nd Army clung to survival. German commanders believed final victory was days away. They were focused on the wrong battle. Soviet planners had been preparing Operation Uranus, a massive encirclement targeting the weaker Romanian and Italian forces, holding the flanks north and south of Stalingrad. The Wehrmacht had extended itself into a salient, confident that its allies could hold defensive positions. On November 19th, Soviet forces attacked north of the city. On November 20th, they attacked to the south. Within 4 days, the pincers closed. The German 6th Army, roughly 250,000 men, was surrounded. The trap was deliberate, calculated, and reflected lessons learned from 2 years of catastrophic defeats. Soviet commanders had studied German encirclement tactics and applied them. Mechanized forces punched through weak points, bypassed strong points, drove deep into rear areas, then turned to close the pocket. The execution was not flawless, but it worked. The hunters became the hunted. Hitler ordered the Sixth Army to hold Stalingrad and await relief. Supply by air was promised. The Luftwaffe attempted to deliver supplies but could not match the tonnage required. The pocket began to starve. Soviet forces tightened the ring. A German relief attempt in December was stopped short of breaking through. The Sixth Army remained trapped in the ruins it had fought to capture. Through January 1943, the pocket was compressed. Soviet artillery pounded German positions. Infantry assaults cleared strong points. The Germans fought with the desperation of men who understood no surrender would be accepted easily. By late January, resistance fractured. Field Marshal Paulus, commanding the Sixth Army, surrendered on January 31st. Scattered fighting continued for another 2 days. Roughly 90,000 German soldiers went into Soviet captivity. Most would not survive it. Stalingrad was the turning point, not because it ended German offensive capability. The Wehrmacht would launch one more major offensive in 1943, but because it demonstrated that the Red Army could plan and execute complex operations successfully. The defense of the city showcased Soviet resilience. The encirclement showcased Soviet operational competence. The victory was celebrated across the Allied world, but in Moscow, it was understood as evidence of transformation. The Red Army that stumbled in 1941 was becoming something more dangerous. The question now was whether that transformation could be sustained through the battles yet to come. The front went quiet in the spring of 1943. Both sides rebuilt. The Red Army absorbed new equipment, integrated lessons from Stalingrad, and prepared for the next German offensive. Soviet intelligence reported a German buildup near the city of Kursk, where the front line formed a salient bulging westward into German-held territory. The shape of the front invited encirclement. German planners saw an opportunity to repeat the successes of 1941. Pincer movements north and south of the bulge, trapping Soviet forces, restoring German initiative. Operation Citadel launched on July 5, 1943. German forces attacked with new heavy tanks, Tigers and Panthers, supported by assault guns and coordinated air support. The Wehrmacht committed its best units to the offensive. Soviet defenses absorbed the attack. The Red Army had prepared the Kursk salient with layered defensive positions, anti-tank obstacles, minefields, and massed artillery. Intelligence had provided advance warning of German plans. Soviet forces knew where and when the blow would fall. German advances measured in miles, not the tens of miles achieved in previous summers. Each defensive line slowed the attack. Soviet reserves counterattacked, forcing German units to halt and regroup. The fighting was attritional, mechanical, industrial. Tank battles at Prokhorovka on July 12th involved over 1,000 armored vehicles, one of the largest tank engagements in history. The fight was close-range chaos. Soviet T-34s closed with German Tigers to negate the German advantage in armor and gun range. Losses were heavy on both sides. The German advance stalled. Hitler called off the offensive on July 13th. German forces had penetrated Soviet defenses, but failed to achieve a breakthrough. The Red Army had held, and more importantly, had prepared counter-offensives. Soviet forces attacked north and south of the Kursk Bulge, pushing German armies back. The Wehrmacht retreated, contesting every mile, but the strategic initiative had passed permanently to the Soviet side. The Battle of Kursk marked the end of German offensive operations on the Eastern Front. From this point forward, the Wehrmacht would fight defensive battles, attempting to delay the inevitable, while the Eastern Front consumed men and equipment faster than Germany could replace them. The Red Army, meanwhile, was growing stronger. Production from relocated factories reached full capacity. American and British aid, trucks, locomotives, raw materials, sustained Soviet logistics. Training improved. Coordination between infantry, armor, and artillery became more effective. The lessons purchased with blood in 1941 and 1942 now translated into operational success. Soviet offensives in late 1943 liberated much of Ukraine. Kiev fell in November. The Dnieper River, which German commanders had hoped to use as a defensive barrier, was crossed at multiple points. German forces retreated toward pre-war borders, fighting delaying actions, inflicting casualties. But unable to reverse the momentum, the Red Army was becoming a machine capable of sustained offensive operations, something it had not achieved earlier in the war. By the beginning of 1944, Soviet forces had driven German armies from most of Soviet territory. The front line now approached the borders of Poland, Romania, and the Baltic states. The next phase would not be defense. It would be liberation, and beyond liberation, conquest. The question facing Soviet planners was no longer survival. It was how far west the Red Army would advance before the war ended, and what political order would emerge from the wreckage of occupied Europe. Soviet forces crossed into Poland in January 1944. The advance was methodical, overwhelming, and driven by an industrial base that now outproduced Germany in every category. Tanks, artillery, aircraft, Soviet factories delivered equipment in quantities that allowed commanders to replace losses and still grow stronger. The logistical system, aided by American-supplied trucks and rail equipment, kept armies supplied across vast distances. The first Soviet objective was to clear German forces from Soviet territory entirely. Leningrad's siege was broken. The Baltic states were liberated, reconquered, depending on perspective. In the south, Soviet forces pushed into Romania. Germany's allies began defecting. Romania switched sides in August 1944. Bulgaria followed. Finland negotiated an armistice. The coalition Hitler had assembled to invade the Soviet Union was disintegrating. Operation Barbarossa, launched in June 1944, timed to coincide with Allied landings in Normandy. Soviet forces attacked Army Group Center across Belarus with overwhelming force. The offensive shattered German defenses. Entire German armies were encircled and destroyed. The advance liberated Minsk, pushed into Poland, reached the outskirts of Warsaw. In 6 weeks, Army Group Center lost roughly 500,000 men. The scale of the defeat exceeded Stalingrad. Warsaw rose in revolt in August 1944, expecting Soviet support. Soviet forces halted on the east bank of the Vistula River. The official explanation was operational exhaustion and German resistance. The political reality was more calculated. The uprising was led by the Polish Home Army, loyal to the Polish government in exile in London, not to Soviet interests. Stalin allowed the Germans to crush the revolt. Over 2 months, German forces systematically destroyed Warsaw and killed an estimated 200,000 civilians. Soviet forces resumed their advance only after the city was pacified. The signal was clear. Post-war Poland would be shaped by Soviet power, not by forces aligned with the West. Soviet advances continued through the fall and winter of 1944. The Red Army drove into Hungary, where German forces defended Budapest street by street in a brutal siege that mirrored Stalingrad. Yugoslavia was liberated in coordination with Tito's communist partisans. By January 1945, Soviet forces stood along the Vistula River in Poland, preparing for the final offensive into Germany itself. The industrial heartland of the Soviet Union was scarred beyond recognition. Cities lay in ruins. 27 million Soviet citizens were dead. Soldiers and civilians, combatants and victims. The demographic damage would echo for generations. Entire villages had been erased. Infrastructure was destroyed. Agricultural production had collapsed in occupied areas. The Soviet Union had survived, but the cost was staggering. And yet the Red Army now possessed the capacity to advance into the heart of Europe. The suffering fueled a desire for retribution. Soviet soldiers advancing into Germany saw the wealth of German towns and farms, untouched by the devastation visited upon Soviet territory. The comparison bred rage. Orders from Moscow emphasized discipline, but the reality on the ground was darker. German civilians fled westward ahead of Soviet forces, fearing what was coming. The final push began. January 12, 1945. Soviet forces launched the Vistula Oder offensive. Over 2 million soldiers, supported by thousands of tanks and artillery pieces, attacked across the entire Polish front. German defenses collapsed. The Red Army advanced at speeds reminiscent of German blitzkrieg in 1941, but this time Soviet logistics kept pace. Mechanized forces drove deep into German territory. Warsaw fell. Krakow fell. By February, Soviet armies stood on the Oder River, 40 miles from Berlin. The advance was accompanied by atrocities. Soviet soldiers, brutalized by years of total war and witness to German atrocities in occupied Soviet territory, exacted revenge on German civilians. Rape, murder, looting, widespread and systematic. Officers made limited efforts to enforce discipline. The official Soviet position denied widespread misconduct. The reality, documented in diaries and reports, was that German civilians experienced a campaign of retribution. Estimates suggest hundreds of thousands of German women were assaulted. Entire towns were emptied as populations fled west. Soviet forces also liberated concentration camps. Majdanek in Poland was the first major camp captured in July 1944. Auschwitz was liberated in January 1945. Soviet soldiers found survivors, emaciated, traumatized, bearing witness to industrialized murder. The camps provided evidence of Nazi atrocities, but the information was not immediately publicized in the way Western liberation of camps would be. The Soviet focus was military victory, not documentation of genocide. The liberation was real, but its propagandistic use would come later. Berlin became the final objective. Stalin wanted Soviet forces to capture the Nazi capital before Western allies could reach it. The race was political as much as military. Allied forces were advancing from the west. Soviet forces prepared for a massive urban assault. The Battle of Berlin began on April 16, 1945. Soviet forces surrounded the city and attacked from multiple directions. German defenders, Wehrmacht remnants, Volkssturm militia, Hitler Youth fought with the desperation of those who understood defeat meant captivity or death. The fighting was brutal and close range. Artillery reduced buildings to rubble. Tanks engaged at point-blank range. Soviet infantry cleared buildings floor by floor. Casualties mounted daily. By late April, Soviet forces reached the center of Berlin. On April 30th, Hitler committed suicide in his bunker. On May 2nd, Berlin surrendered. Soviet soldiers raised a red flag over the Reichstag, a photograph staged for propaganda but symbolically powerful. The capital of the Reich had fallen to the forces it had tried to annihilate 4 years earlier. Germany surrendered unconditionally on May 8, 1945. The war in Europe was over. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe from the Baltic to the Balkans. The Red Army had fought from the gates of Moscow to the heart of Berlin. The cost was 27 million dead, a number so vast it defies comprehension. Entire cities were gone. Generations were missing. The Soviet Union emerged victorious, but wounded in ways that would shape its trajectory for decades. The post-war settlement was negotiated at Yalta and Potsdam. Stalin secured Soviet control over Eastern Europe. Poland's borders shifted west, incorporating German territory and ceding eastern regions to the Soviet Union. The Baltic states remained Soviet. Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and East Germany fell into the Soviet sphere. The division of Europe was not yet formalized, but the architecture was in place. The wartime alliance with Britain and the United States was already fraying. The Soviet Union had survived the greatest invasion in history, adapted under existential pressure, and emerged as one of two superpowers. The transformation was complete. The state that had nearly collapsed in 1941 now projected power across half of Europe. The cost in human suffering was immense. The geopolitical consequences would define the second half of the 20th century. The Red Army demobilized, slowly. Soldiers who had fought from Stalingrad to Berlin returned to a country devastated by war. Reconstruction began immediately. Factories rebuilt, cities cleared of rubble, agriculture restarted. The economy remained centralized and militarized. The population endured continued hardship in the name of recovery. Stalin consolidated control. Returning prisoners of war were treated with suspicion. Many were sent to labor camps for having been captured or exposed to the West. The paranoia that had characterized the pre-war purges returned in different forms. The victory over Germany did not bring freedom. It brought stability under authoritarian rule and the beginning of a new confrontation with former allies. The Soviet experience of the Second World War was fundamentally different from that of any other combatant. No other nation endured comparable losses. No other nation saw such devastation of its territory. No other nation transformed so completely in the crucible of total war. The numbers tell part of the story. 27 million dead, roughly 14% of the pre-war Soviet population. Military casualties exceeded 8 million. The rest were civilians, murdered by occupying forces, starved in sieges, killed in bombings, worked to death in labor camps, or caught in the crossfire of advancing and retreating armies. Entire demographic cohorts were hollowed out. The imbalance between men and women persisted for decades. Physical destruction was comprehensive. 1,700 towns and 70,000 villages were destroyed. 32,000 factories were demolished or damaged. The agricultural base was shattered. Livestock killed. Fields mined. Equipment destroyed. The economic cost was incalculable. Reconstruction would take years and required continued sacrifice from a population already bled white. But the war also forged a narrative that would sustain Soviet legitimacy for generations. The Great Patriotic War became the defining event of Soviet identity. The victory over fascism validated the Soviet system, obscured its failures and crimes, and provided a source of pride that transcended ideology. Every family had lost someone. Every community had a story. The collective memory of suffering and triumph became the foundation of post-war Soviet culture. The military transformation was real. The Red Army that collapsed in 1941 emerged in 1945 as a sophisticated fighting force capable of complex operations across vast distances. Soviet commanders had learned operational art through trial and catastrophic error. The industrial base, relocated and expanded, demonstrated that central planning could achieve results under existential pressure. The lessons were genuine, even if the costs were horrific. The political legacy was darker. Stalin used victory to tighten control, suppress dissent, and justify continued militarization. The Soviet Union emerged from the war as a superpower, but one whose population remained poor, traumatized, and subject to authoritarian rule. The territories gained in Eastern Europe were held by force, their populations subjected to Soviet-style systems they had not chosen. The Iron Curtain descended not as a metaphor, but as a physical reality. Barbed wire, border guards, and the understanding that leaving the Soviet sphere meant death. The Cold War began before the Hot War ended. Soviet and Western forces met at the Elbe River in Germany with handshakes and staged celebrations, but the underlying tension was evident. The alliance had been one of convenience against a common enemy. With Germany defeated, the fundamental incompatibilities between Soviet and Western systems reasserted themselves. The next 4 decades would be defined by the struggle between the two superpowers forged in the crucible of the Second World War. For the Soviet Union, victory meant survival and transformation, but not peace. The country that emerged in 1945 was harder, more militarized, more paranoid, and more powerful than the one invaded in 1941. It had proven that industrial mobilization and ruthless determination could overcome even shattering initial defeats. It had demonstrated that geography and population could absorb losses that would destroy smaller nations. And it had shown that the Soviet system, for all its brutality and inefficiency, could function under pressures that would shatter more humane alternatives. The soldiers who raised the flag over the Reichstag returned to a country that honored their sacrifice while demanding continued obedience. The civilians who survived siege and occupation returned to cities that were wastelands requiring reconstruction. The prisoners who endured German captivity found themselves imprisoned again by their own government. Victory was real, but it came wrapped in suffering that would echo for generations. August 23, 1939. Two men shook hands over a map and believed they had secured their futures. By June 1941, the agreement was worthless. By May 1945, one of the signatories was dead by suicide in a Berlin bunker. The other stood atop a continental empire built on the corpses of 27 million of his own people. The arc from that midnight signing to the flag over the Reichstag represents the most dramatic national transformation of the 20th century. The Soviet Union entered the war as a backward state with a purged military and outdated equipment. It emerged as a superpower with battle-hardened armies, an industrial base that outproduced its enemies, and control over half of Europe. The journey between those 2 points was paved with suffering on a scale that defies comprehension. This was not the clean narrative of good versus evil that characterizes Western memory of the war. The Soviet Union was not a democracy defending freedom. It was an authoritarian state fighting for survival against an enemy bent on extermination. Stalin's regime was brutal before the war, brutal during it, and brutal after. The victory over Nazi Germany was real and necessary, but it did not redeem the Soviet system. It empowered it. The soldiers who survived returned to a country that celebrated their sacrifice while maintaining the apparatus of repression. Victory parades marched through Moscow, while political prisoners remained in camps. Medals were awarded while families starved in provinces devastated by occupation. The triumph was genuine, but it existed alongside continued suffering that the state preferred to ignore. For the Soviet people, the war became sacred memory. The Great Patriotic War transcended Stalin, transcended communism, transcended ideology. It was the moment when survival required everything and received it. The siege of Leningrad, the stand at Stalingrad, the drive to Berlin, these became touchstones of identity that outlasted the Soviet Union itself. When the USSR collapsed in 1991, the memory of the war remained. It remains still. The geopolitical consequences shaped the post-war world. Eastern Europe fell under Soviet control, not through choice, but through occupation. The Baltic states, absorbed in 1940, remained Soviet republics. Poland, for which Britain and France had ostensibly gone to war in 1939, traded one occupation for another. The division of Europe lasted until 1989. The trauma of Soviet occupation shaped the politics of Eastern Europe for generations. The military lessons were studied by every nation with ambitions to field modern armies. Soviet operational art, the ability to coordinate massive forces across vast distances, to sustain offensives over months, to absorb catastrophic losses and continue fighting, became a model. The doctrines developed through blood and failure on the Eastern Front influenced military thinking globally. The Red Army's transformation from the shambling giant of 1941 to the efficient machine of 1945 demonstrated what could be achieved through ruthless prioritization and acceptance of staggering casualties. But the human cost remained beyond calculation. 27 million is a statistic. Behind it are individual deaths. The teenager who froze in a trench near Moscow, the mother who starved in Leningrad, the prisoner who died on a forced march, the civilian caught in an artillery barrage. Each one was a life with hopes and fears, a family and friends, a future that was erased. The aggregate number represents a wound in the Soviet population that never fully healed. The Soviet Union never fought another war like it. The experience was so traumatic, the cost so severe, that it colored every subsequent Soviet military and political decision. The Cold War remained cold, partly because Soviet leadership understood what total war actually meant. They had experienced it. They had survived it. They had no desire to repeat it. This is the entire Second World War as the Soviet Union fought it. Not a story of triumph alone, but of catastrophe, transformed through brutal adaptation into victory at costs that still stagger the imagination. The flag raised over Berlin in May 1945 represented survival, vengeance, and the emergence of a superpower. But it was planted in the rubble of a shattered continent by soldiers who had seen their own country burned and knew exactly what war meant. The pact, signed in 1939, promised peace. It delivered the largest and deadliest conflict ever fought on European soil. The calculations made by men in rooms far from battlefields proved worthless against the reality of industrial warfare. In the end, the Soviet Union prevailed not through superior strategy or moral clarity, but through the willingness to sacrifice everything and the geographic and demographic depth to absorb losses that would destroy any smaller nation. The war ended. The memory endures. And the questions it raises about the price of survival remain unanswered. If this story moved you, challenged you, or helped you see the Second World War differently, it would be an honor to have you join our growing community. Subscribing isn't just a click. It's a way to support more powerful stories, more forgotten voices, and more truth from the past. So if you believe these stories matter, hit that subscribe button and let's keep building this journey together. And don't forget to leave a comment. We read everyone and love hearing your thoughts. Until next time, keep exploring history with Epic War. Keep asking questions. Keep seeking the truth.